Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, a podcast where we explore the artistry and craft of storytelling across different media. Today, I'm excited to have Alina Pete with us. Alina is a Canadian author, illustrator, and game designer, celebrated for their innovative storytelling, bridging the gap between Indigenous narratives and contemporary themes. Their works challenge boundaries and reflect a deep commitment to a cultural heritage. Today, we'll explore the fascinating world of Indigenous Futurism and how blending old myths with modern narratives can inspire new generations of storytellers. So, let's dig into it. Alina, thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to talk about Indigenous Futurisms today.
So am I. This has been on my list for a little while now, and then finally I had a friend connect us, so I'm excited as well. Before we dig into the topic of the day, though, I do like to kind of get some foundation, your origin story, if you will. Like, how did you fall in love with storytelling and gaming and the whole world of nerd culture? What was your journey like to get you where you are today, and what are you up to today? Kind of just give me that whole story.
Oh, that could be we could be here for hours.
I know.
So my origin story is, as a kid, I was always very interested in like creating little worlds for myself. So one of the things I would do, my mom was a teen mom, and so she was going to university while I was very young. And one of the things she would do is while she was studying, she'd put papers or coloring books out for me. And I would sit there and make up characters, doodle little worlds. I found one of my earliest comics a little while ago when she was cleaning out her house. And it was about, this is a deep cut, Bubsy the Bobcat, which is an ancient video game character. And it was just adventures based on that game. It was like a little 2-pager comic. It was very cute. It was very bad. I was like 7. And so my mom always really encouraged that. And when I was a little bit older, sort of in my 12 and up, sort of preteens, that sort of thing, she got a job as a Indigenous consultant for the public school board in Saskatoon. And so she was going around telling stories to different school groups, sometimes at their schools, but most often out at a camp just outside of Saskatoon called Beaver Creek. Absolutely gorgeous area, naturalized, beautiful. And so there'd be little school groups out there of younger kids, and she would tell stories about, traditional Cree stories, mostly about coyotes, sometimes about the constellations. And so she brought me with her because, then she didn't have to get a babysitter for that night. But I realized later what she was actually doing was training me to be a storyteller. Because there was one night when she just turned to me and she's like, Elena, you've heard this one a lot of times. Why don't you tell it? And suddenly, me, a little awkward 14-year-old, had to stand before a class of, I think, first graders and tell the story. And I was very awkward. I'm sure I stammered over my words, but that was when I was like, oh, that's what we're doing.
Right on. So how did you get into it professionally? What was your entry point there?
I think webcomics is sort of where I started. So a lot of people will know me from the webcomic Where Geek, which I ran for many, 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 many years. But Where Geek is a really interesting thing because I had, after high school, gone to college to be an animator. And the school I was at shut down in my second year. And so I wasn't able to complete my degree there. And I was like, I want to keep, building my drawing skills. Even if I can't go to this school, maybe I'll get in at another school. What's the best way to do that? And my partner suggested, well, I like reading webcomics. You like reading webcomics. Why don't you do one? It'll make sure that you draw a little bit every week if you're putting out a couple updates. And then you can keep working on all the things. Like I was a very character face and expression focused, but absolutely horrible at backgrounds. And I was like, well, actually that's a really good idea because comics, you have to draw the backgrounds every panel. So it started as a way to just keep my hand in and strengthen my drawing skills. But what I didn't realize is I'd tricked myself into writing at the same time. So you have to write the world of the comic that you're telling. So I trained myself how to write jokes without knowing that I was doing it. I trained myself how to do story arcs and plot out an arc in small episodic formats, which is a very weird skill that I didn't realize at the time was so specialized because it was just a thing I was doing to make my comic happen.
Yeah. So what are you up to today? What's your current, that you can talk about, professional world look like?
Yeah, well, there was a couple of things that made me move away from webcomics, one of which was just I'd been doing it for a really long time and, and not giving myself enough breaks. So doing 3 comics a week for 15 plus years, I was starting to hit a burnout point. But also the industry had shifted. After the adpocalypse that started on YouTube, online ad revenue just tanked almost overnight. So I'd gone from it being a career that was fairly sustainable. I was making like rent and grocery money every month easily, running ads on my website, to overnight they crashed to less than $200. So like that was like losing your job. I tried to rebuild that over the years, and it has not rebounded. So I was looking to move away from that business model. And part of how I did that was through freelancing. So I started writing short stories to submit to anthologies, but also just other ideas for things that I wanted to develop. And so I had this little bank of stories saved on my hard drive. And recently I've been sort of pursuing that more deliberately, seeking out more writing contracts, all based around sort of the ideas of Indigenous futurisms, because there's not a lot, there wasn't a lot. I should say there's now quite a few, actually, and I can name like a handful of authors off the top of my head who are Indigenous and writing sci-fi. But there didn't used to be any stories of us in the future. One of the things I like to talk about, and one of the stories that I actually wrote in my anthology, Indigenous, was a Dorvan 5, that like famous episode of Star Trek, the next generation, infamous really, where the Federation has to move a group of natives off of a planet that they've claimed so that they can have their own cultural practices because they're in the Cardassian contested space. So it was really impactful on me as a young kid to see Native people in the future, because often in the past, if we're talking about it at all, and not, hey, look, we're still there in the future and actually thriving. We have our own culture and planet. That's awesome. But it was, even in that context, it was a metaphor for colonization. It was just fully an episode about colonial practices of the Federation moving Native people off their planet. So I thought about it more and more over the years, and I was like, yeah, actually, that's really depressing that the only time we see ourselves represented in the future, we're still being affected by colonization.
That's okay. Well, that's the topic. That's what I want to dig into. There is a question I do like to ask, if it doesn't come up, just as part of your background, your origin story. Did you play a lot of tabletop role-playing games, board games? Was there physical space games that were part of your journey and a part of what makes you a creative these days?
Ooh, that's like two different questions. I'll answer what makes you a creative these days, and that's a mix of hope and spite, which I think is what we're all going to need to get through this future that's happening.
Yeah.
I want to create hope for others, and I keep creating on my darkest days out of spite because I'm still here, damn it. But what am I doing these days, and how did I get into the TTRPG space is digitally. I started on Mushes way back in the ancient days of the internet. That was where I started role-playing because it was something it was very easily accessible. Something I do from my home. I didn't need a gaming group. You just log on and there would be posts. So play by post, Mushes, forum role play, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And then after I got out of high school, there was a couple unsuccessful attempts to join D&D groups in high school, but it was not great to be a young femme presenting person in a lot of D&D groups those days. Mm-hmm. So online was much safer. But then after I got out of high school and went into college, I joined a LARP group in Saskatoon. So Saskatoon by night. We were vampires. We would play games in the campus club rooms down in the steam tunnels under the campus. And I loved that because it scratched that itch of, I was a theater kid in high school, so I got that theatrical element of being another character or being another person, dressing up, being very dramatic. And it was a very social experience. A lot of the friends I still have these days are friends from LARP years and years and years ago.
Very. Is that LARP group still going today? Do you know? I'm curious.
I think some version of it still exists in Saskatoon. I know there are people there and that they're still LARPing. Well, but I've LARPed there. I've LARPed in Edmonton, which is a place I moved later, and I'm out here in Vancouver. Haven't been to a LARP since the pandemic hit, but I'm still in touch with all my LARP friends from here. So
it's only a matter of time.
Yep. I'm waiting for the nasal spray vaccines, basically.
There you go. All right. Well, let's dig into the topic of the day, Indigenous Futurism, as you have put forth already. This is an intriguing concept. I love the idea, but I want to hear, what's your definition? How would you define it? How does it set the stage for your storytelling?
I would define Indigenous Futurisms as any story about Indigenous people by Indigenous people that centers us in continuity. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the future, but and in Indigenous storytelling, it's often common to be cyclical. So things in the past and the future are interchangeable. Time is a little bit of a circle, which is why I don't just say automatically, oh, it's futures, it's us in the future. But anything that centers our continuity as a people throughout many ages, often set in the future. Like I said, it's super powerful in a media space where we've only been centered in the past, and often a very, people want to hear our most painful stories. So if it's not set in a pre-contact past, it's often set right during the heart of colonization, like the residential school, the pass and permit system area. And that's, as an Indigenous person looking for representation in the media, that's really depressing. You don't want to be engaging with that over and over and over again, because every time it has a spiritual cost, it hurts you emotionally. And so if that's the only stories out there, the stories of our pain, it's overwhelming. Whereas futurisms, they're really hopeful. Like it puts us in a place where we're still there. We have our own places. We've, fought through the apocalypse we're living through, and we now live in a sort of green punk future that's informed by Indigenous practices. So I think Indigenous futurism centers us on that continuity, but it also engages with other people to bring them forward too. It's saying, look, if we're still here, you're also still here. We all make it. We're all fine.
I love that term, green punk. I like that. That's cool. So when you're telling these stories, you're tapping into Indigenous stories, Indigenous myths, the practice and the history and the stories that came before. And we're starting to see more and more of that. I mean, it's not on the level of Norse mythology and all these other ones, but how does the story structure of those traditional stories and myths impact or affect your storytelling, your structure?
That's interesting, because I have in my head what I like to call my storyteller voice, and it's very much the same as I would have if I was telling a coyote story. It's a really theatrical inner voice. It's very slow and thoughtful, and I'm moving my arms around and moving my body to bring people into the story more. And so I will take that, and oftentimes my first drafts of Indigenous futurisms come out a lot closer to an Old Norse epic than what you would necessarily expect, because they're very dramatic. I'm trying to get that drama that I would bring with my body to a story into the paper through words. And so it comes out feeling not what people would expect when they start to engage with Indigenous storytelling. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is, because a lot of First Nations legends were translated from, in my case, in Cree, in the Hill, was my people, into English, there was a lot lost in the translation, because partially it was the bias of the translators who were simplifying the very long, flowing, poetic Nahil words into English, and the bias of trying to make these stories simpler because they're for children, even though in traditional ways, storytelling is not for children, it's for everybody. These are our histories, these are our oral tradition. But the colonial view of stories, especially fairy stories, is that they're for kids, right? So the stories often got really simplified and didn't crush down. But I think the heart of the stories in the original Nihil, which I don't speak a lot of, but I've heard more accurate translations of, they are a lot more like Beowulf. They're epic, they're flowing, they're poetic. Nihil is a very poetic language, similar to other languages where there's prefixes and suffixes that go onto the verb, and so the word can have all these different meanings, but it's all anchored onto the one noun that you're talking about.
Very cool. I'm curious, go down a rabbit hole. I like to study the roots of story as an evolutionary tool, a tool that's allowed our species to flourish and spread, and the precursor to the written word as the way to pass down generational knowledge. I'm curious, if you go back, like you were mentioning, you go back to those old vocally passed down stories, they tend to get longer. Like you say, they tend to get slower of pace. Do you think the change is because our attention spans are shrinking over time, or is it an effect of Christianity trying to impose its will on everything, or is it just a natural evolution of stories?
I think our attention spans have definitely gotten shorter. So, especially in the past few years since TikTok came out, people want really quick little sound bites that they can interact with, and lots of them. And that's its whole other problem. But yeah, I think a lot of the shortening comes from that, like I said, the translation bias of these are for children, these are short snippets. We don't want to have them in their entirety. But also our time as an audience has gotten lesser. We don't have a lot of time to engage with things anymore. And again, that's part of why TikTok is very popular, because people can sit and scroll for a couple minutes and then go off and do whatever. Traditionally, stories, especially the big stories, like the big epics, a lot of the histories, all the creation stories were only told in winter. And so the sort of smaller stories, like family stories, stories about, oh, remember that one time you and your uncle did this when you were young, blah, blah, blah. That was told all year round. The smaller family stories, the funny little stories about you and your friends. But the big stories were saved for winter, because winter is a time of downtime to recharge. You're in one place a lot more. It's a lot darker out. So stories were what filled that downtime. And so they had the opportunity to really sprawl and be long and slow, and to engage with them over a long period of time.
I like that concept of winter stories versus summer stories. There's something there. That's smart. Yeah. Okay, well, when it comes to blending traditional Indigenous stories into modern stories, as you do so well, what are some of the challenges that come up?
Think of them as challenges.
Opportunities?
Interesting. Yeah, basically, I like digging down into all right, how am I going to do this? So one of the comics I wrote for an anthology called Moonshot, the Moonshot Volume 2, the theme of the anthology was, let's retell Native stories, like traditional Native stories, but let's tell them in a modern context. And so I really wanted to tell a story about my grandmother's reserve, which is the one I spent the most time on growing up. So my grandma's reserve is Capel, just down in the Capel Valley. Mm-hmm. And we would go down there. It's a beautiful valley. Like the prairie just sort of falls into this lovely little river valley. The winds are a lot less bad down there. There's lots of poplar bluffs. It was a great place to play as a kid with my cousins. But there was a legend there about the voices that live in the lake. And if they call your name, they're trying to lure you into the water. And so people on the reserve would always be like, yeah, if you hear someone calling your name, don't go to the water. Like, go inside, shut the doors, shut the windows, don't listen. And so there's various iterations of that legend, but one that gets told the most widely is E. Pauline Johnson, who is contentious for various reasons. But in this one particular version, she was a native storyteller, but she told all her stories for a very British audience. So she has a story about the Capel Valley. And Capel is the Frenchification of the valley's actual Cree name, which is Katepwa, which means it calls. And so Capel is who calls in French. And it's because of those voices from the lake. Right. So that's why the valley is named that. So she has a story about it's very dramatized. It's like a native man is coming to marry a native princess who lives in the valley, and he's canoeing and he hears her voice calling out to him from the water. And so he knows something bad has happened. And when he gets there, she's died, and it's a tragedy. It's very dramatic. But I was thinking about that legend and recontextualizing it, and I was like, this is a story that's got a lot of themes around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? Like, there's a man who's gone away on a journey, and in my story, it was a man who had gone to Alberta to go work in the oil rigs up at Fort Mac. Mm-hmm. And so while he's away, his girlfriend goes missing. And so the story is him returning to the valley because he's heard her voice calling to him in dreams. And so when he gets there, he hears her and sees her calling to him from the lake. And she's saying, come, I miss you, come. And that's a story that I left. He's standing by the water, and then the fog rolls in, and when it rolls out again, he's gone. So it's up to the viewer to decide, did he go in the lake after her, or did he leave to carry on with life elsewhere? Which is something that Native stories do a lot, too. They'll leave the ending sort of up to you to interpret and figure out why you're being told this story.
That's powerful. Wow. You highlight two important things there that I kind of want to bring to bear. One is the idea that Indigenous stories offer fresh viewpoints for modern audiences that allow us to reconsider stories and things that are happening in real life, like the important discussion around missing and murdered Indigenous women. And then also the difference in structure that, like you say, the endings that are left for interpretation, very much not a Western story structure. You'll find it some in the Eastern story structure similar to that, but very much not the way a 3-act structure, a Marvel movie. So things like that, are we seeing more of them? Is there a shift in perspective happening?
I think so. I have been reading. I love reading sci-fi generally, and always have. And I've been reading a lot more like Afrofuturism, Chinese futurisms. The like I love some of the traditional Chinese stories because there's some similarities in there with some of the native epics. I really like seeing that similarities and differences because their story structure is not a Western story structure, but it's also very different from Indigenous story structure. And I love comparing them. Like this is a thing I nerd out about frequently. The Korean stories too are really fascinating. Read them if you haven't. But yeah, I think growing up in the Western world, we all know the Western story structure, right? The hero's journey gets put over and over again. That's the only stories we had growing up. But now there's this wealth of new voices coming into genre circles, and I find that exciting because it's a new, fresh take on a lot of things, right? It's another way to contextualize stories that we thought we were familiar with, but bring a completely different perspective and a completely different meaning to these stories that we thought.
You think there'll be a point where the blending and the merging of these different structures and viewpoints and ways of telling story is going to create something completely new that nobody saw coming?
I hope so.
Wouldn't that be cool?
That'd be
Like
great.
a completely new structure that just kind of takes the best of all the worlds, or an interesting way to tie them there. When you're creating such a story, modern telling, how do you stay true to the spirit of an Indigenous tale while telling a modern story for the modern audience?
That's an interesting one because in some ways you kind of can't. So native stories are, think of them like living beings, right? They are carried by the person who has been entrusted with them. And they've been entrusted with them in a way that means that you're not supposed to change them. You're supposed to carry them. It would dishonor the story if you were to take it and put your own spin on it. So a lot of ways, it's impossible to translate the oral tradition into stories, but that doesn't mean that you can't engage with it and change it, especially if you're going to your elders and asking protocols, sort of like, is this a story that I can tell? Here's the way I want to retell it. Is that okay? Because obviously you're already changing it by going, I'm going to take it from an oral tradition and put it onto the page. So that's already one change. I'm also already writing it in English because that's all I speak. Thanks, colonization. So you go in, you're changing the story. You're changing its format. You're changing its language. And then you can work with your community to be like, what other things can I change about that? Here's a story I want to tell. So one of the ones that I'm working on right now is a retelling of the Ayasi myth, which is sort of native Hercules, in that he's a hero who has a big journey to go on. There are a series of tasks, and they're the same in every story across the area. It's a legend that's told by Cree people, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. Like there's various versions of this story, and he's all got slightly different names. But the trails he goes through are the same, and with a couple exceptions. There's a few things that get left out of one person's version versus the other. And so I was like, I want to tell this, but I want to tell it as a cyberpunk story because in the traditional legend, there's two witches he comes across in the woods, and they have bone spurs growing out of their arms, and they use these bones, or out of their elbows, and they use the bone spurs coming out of their elbows to try and kill him. And so he has to trick them into attacking each other instead. And I'm like, well, that's just mantis blades. Like that's cyberpunk as it gets. And so I worked backwards, and then there's a lot of things about him like confusing hunting dogs on his trail by going underground. And I'm like, well, that takes place on the Matrix, obviously.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So when you're working on something like that, do you go and speak with the elders? Do you do the work to make sure it's all...
Yeah.
So
well, I think you have to. It's the only way to be respectful.
I 100% agree. I guess that was kind of a launching point to ask the question, somebody who is not Indigenous, not part of the culture, who is trying to be respectful and tell a story that is borrowing from that, how would they go about it?
I would caution people who aren't part of a Native community. And I don't mean not Indigenous, but I mean like if you are somebody who's worked with a Native community and you've sort of been given the go-ahead to tell a particular story, that's okay because that's them going, okay, you know how to do this right. You're not coming in and being extractive and exploitive. We'll trust you in this. So I would caution people, just if you want to get in to tell Native stories and you're not part of a Native community in that way, just don't.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. And then if you are doing the work, check in with the community frequently and be like, hey, am I still doing this right? Have I messed anything up? I don't want to do this the wrong way.
Beautiful. Well, you've given me a couple examples to think about, but can you think of other examples perhaps from like WereGeek where you've integrated that Indigenous futurism and traditional myths to create something interesting and new? Just out of curiosity.
I didn't actually bring a lot of Native stuff into WereGeek, which is interesting. In my head, Abby was biracial, so she was Native and Black, and I never put that on the page, but that was just sort of my headcanon for my own characters.
Neat.
I think there's a scene of her house where she's got some siblings running around. You can sort of see her mom in the background. And that's as close as I came to really putting it on the pages. And it's one of the things I regret the most about my arc of WereGeek was not bringing more of that cultural stuff into the telling. I really wanted to just focus in on like gaming. And I got really into telling jokes. The 3-4 panel format, like building a joke and then paying off the punchline. So I kept it really focused on the TTRPG world, which was, I do regret that because I wanted to, if I could have said anything with where it should be that like, it's not just a white-centric space. There are other people who also play these games. And I wish I'd focused on that more.
Very cool. Well, now it's out there. I'll tell everybody. Something else that popped, I do this all the time. Something else that popped in my head that's kind of completely wandering off topic. Do you have a favorite Indigenous myth or character that people don't like? Everybody knows about Coyote, but is there more other interesting ones?
I mean, there's so many interesting ones. A lot of people don't know about Ayasi, even though that's like one of the big myths. I love Wasaki-Chak. Wasaki-Chak is sort of the Cree trickster, similar to Nanabojo, that sort of thing. Very lot of overlaps with Coyote, that sort of the fool who is wandering through the world doing things wrong and getting in trouble for it. I love those kinds of stories. But also, a fool that is powerful in the way that they don't have a lot of consequences for the stuff they screw up a lot of times. Like in some stories, they'll die, but then they'll come back later. It's fine.
That reminds me of Anansi from the African mythologies.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. Actually, can't remember the Anansi story, but it's so similar to one Coyote story that I know.
I'm going to go diving now because I love trickster mythology, trickster gods. I mean, even Loki quite often comes off as too powerful or arrogant, but he has stories where he's the fool. Like it's very cool. Well, I think we're starting to draw closer to the end of the core parts here. I guess as we wrap up, what would you say is like the key takeaway for people who are looking at blending old stories from any mythology and being respectful of the culture that it's coming from, and then telling a modern story, a modern retelling, a modern blend?
The biggest thing I've been learning, blending Native legends with like modern takes, is to be really intentional in why you're doing it. So, like, I know a lot of the reasons that I really love Indigenous Futurism is because I want to center our stories in a future, whether it's space or cyberpunk or sort of the green punk, solar punk future that I've been writing in a lot. I think we need to get away from being just our stories being set in the past and just being about our grief. I think we need Indigenous joy. We need Indigenous family dramas and teen romances and horror. Shane Hawk's Don't Whistle at Night has been out on the bestseller list for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. It's so good. I think there's a lot of hunger for Indigenous horror. And I think, honestly, that's why there's been a lot of movies about Indigenous horror lately, is that's a way to sort of say where we are right now. So, like, a lot of the, like, Blood Quantum, movies like that are all, like, listen, Native people have lived through one apocalypse. Our entire way of life game got overturned. And we're now living in a post-apocalyptic world, this, like, strange, backwards world of capitalism where community and people are below corporations and money. Things are done at the expense of people for the benefit of corporations, and that's exactly the opposite of what all of our teachings say. It's being run by maniacs who have that idea in mind. So there's traditional stories and legends about backwards people who live the wrong way and make a weird world that's upside down from ours. And I feel like we're living in that right now. And so I think one of the things that Indigenous futurisms can also do is to give that hope of like, listen, I know you all have been brought up to believe that this is the way the world is supposed to run, but it doesn't have to run this way. And in fact, it's our responsibility to change it and to make the world that we want to live in. So what Indigenous futurisms can do is be like, hey, so what if it was the future and we fixed climate change through living in balance with the earth? So we were able to mitigate a lot of the worst effects by, planting mangroves and restoring some of our old practices. The Klamath Dam removal is a really powerful version of that in our real life timeline, where the Klamath Dams were removed and now the salmon, who are not just brothers and sisters, but like heroes. They give their lives to keep people alive. And we've been mistreating them and making their lands inaccessible for them to come back and make the next generations. Seeing the Klamath Dam removal and seeing the salmon come back literally makes me tear up every time I think about it.
I think you're bang on that if stories are the evolutionary tools that I personally believe them to be, the answers to moving forward are probably hidden inside of Indigenous stories. Like the people who we should have been listening to all along were telling these stories and they just got silenced or pushed down.
I think David Suzuki has a quote about like the only way to try and engage with climate change is to listen to Indigenous people.
Makes perfect sense. Growing up in the middle of nowhere in eastern Alberta, east central Alberta, in the woods, outside of a small village, I can tell you personally, the Indigenous scary stories are the scariest horror stories out there.
They're terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I honestly, I bought a copy of Shane Hawk's book, and I'm too scared to read it.
I remember hearing the Wendigo tale when I was little, and then we had a Manx or a bobcat. We never did find out which one it was that lived around our house. And hearing it cry in the night because they sound like babies that are like in pain, I was best for weeks. Like, yeah, the power of stories.
But stories also give us ways to deal with those things, right?
Yes, indeed.
That's why even though I grew up in a valley that's got strange things going on in it, we were always like, well, you know what? You live respectfully to them. You leave them little gifts. You do your ceremony, and you go inside if you hear someone calling your name. Hey.
The stories teach you to be respectful, and you'll be fine. Like that's very common. Like, All right. Well, we're going to bring an end to that fascinating. I want to do it again sometime, but we've only got so much time. So I'm going to put a pin in that. I do have a couple questions I like to ask everybody, regardless of what you do. And the first one's kind of a philosophical question that I ask absolutely everybody who comes on the show. So I'm going to hit you with it. Yep. In my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but also improv, comic book writing, web comics, video games, all of these things where people can just naturally get along. There's a fellowship regardless of where we come from or how we speak. If you agree with me, and not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds that space together?
I think when we game together, we come into this beautiful space where we're all storytellers for our own characters, and then we weave a story together. And there is nothing more powerful in the world than a bunch of humans making stories together, because it takes the best hopes and dreams and fears out of all of them and kind of merges it into one space that you can all be in. And importantly, it's a space unlike the real world where you have agency to do something about it. That's why we always play the heroes in these games, right? We, in our everyday lives, can feel really disenfranchised, and we're not, but the system is so overwhelming that it can feel that way a lot. But TTRPGs give us a space to be another version, a better version of ourselves, or some part of ourselves that we want to explore more of, in a safe place that we can actually move and change and have agency over. And I think we're going to need that a lot these days.
That is a really good answer. Okay. Couple quick fire questions before we start heading for the door. What are you reading these days?
Oh, God. I was reading, let me just grab it. As Many Ships as Stars by Wayodi Old Bear. The cover is by my friend Sadika Ronas. It's beautiful. It's so good. Highly recommend it. But also, since everything happened in the U.S. recently, I was like, I'm going to engage with that in a minute. I need my comfort book, which is the Murderbot novels.
That's your comfort book.
That's my comfort book. I started reading it last week, and I think I've flown through 4 of them. I'm like just about done Exit Strategy now. I'm carrying on.
Right on. Very cool. And that first one, I'm going to add that to my read list right away here. What are you playing these days?
I'm playing a D&D actual play called Trash Heroes. We're really silly Trash Heroes. That came out of me wanting, during the pandemic, missing my friends that I would go and table with at Gen Con, who are all webcomic artists as well. But we hadn't seen each other in a couple of years, and we were like, hey, what better way to, commemorate Gen Con than to play D&D together online? So we play that every other week. I'm also in 2 different Cypher System actual plays, which are a lot of fun. One is We're All Mad Here, and then another one is just wrapped up our first Chronicle. We're going to be picking it up after Christmas. But that one is a little bit of a homebrew fantasy setting. It's a lot of fun. I get to play a dragon.
I haven't got to touch We're All Mad Here, but I have read through the book. I kickstarted that whole set they did, and it's really cool. That's an excellent implementation. Yeah.
I am playing a bard in that one. I'm playing an idiot rock star who got stuck in fairyland. They're a delight.
Right on. So you say live plays. Are those like streamed on Twitch or?
It's sort of my alternative to not being able to LARP during the pandemic. I still really wanted that like theatrical live experience. And there's something about actual plays and streaming that, you get the feeling of acting to an audience, but you're also with your gaming group and you can be a little theatrical on camera. People can see your facial expressions. I wear a costume because that's one of my things that I love doing.
Well, I want to share that with the world, so you need to tell me the links. Where do people find that?
One is at twitch.tv/WhereGeekComics. That's okay. Trash Heroes. And then the other one is at twitch.tv/Altered Echo Archives. That runs both of those games.
You're busy.
I am. I like to play role-playing games.
Okay, so last quick fire question, but this one takes a little more consideration. If your essence, if the perfect essence of Alina was boiled down and then injected into a game, and that could be digital game, tabletop, role-playing, board game, anything, A, what game world would it be? And B, who would you be? Who is the essence of you in a game? Would it like class, race, stereotype, job, whatever?
Okay, the easy answer for this one is one that probably everyone would give, but like I know what I would be in this one. The answer a lot of people are looking for is like if I was injected into Baldur's Gate D&D / I would be a half-elf ranger with a bird animal companion because I have a lot of parrots.
There you go.
But that is not the correct answer. The correct answer is that I would be in Shadowrun, probably a Decker who is doing exactly what I'm doing right now, which is to try and fight the corporations by spreading hope and empowering people through stories online. So, yeah, probably, I'm probably an elf, but I would like to be an orc.
I want that character now represented in a game or a book or something. That sounds cool. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's my spirit animal right there.
Yeah, I don't fight with guns, I fight with words.
I love that. Ideas over bullets. Mm-hmm. That's a quick fire. That got a little serious for a quick fire, but
well, that's the headspace I'm in these days.
Yeah, lots of us. Well, we're going to start heading for the door. I do like to open up a little space right here. Is there anything you're working on or have worked on in the past you'd like to promote and signal boost, or where can people find you online to keep up with what you're working on, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'm working on a whole bunch of stuff right now. I've been working with a bunch of different Indigenous communities to try and either preserve elder stories through comics, or I'm working with the Smithsonian to foster a bunch of young Indigenous comic artists. So people who are already making comics, but who want to learn more about like surviving in the industry, working with institutions. Those are the things I'm proudest of. I'm also working on a half dozen stories. Some of them I can't tell anyone about. But again, they're all trying to weave my little songs of hope to get us through these dark times. So
Where should people go if they want to support you or just follow your work or sir?
You can find me online at alina-pete.com. That's got all the stuff that I'm up to, but I'm most often on Blue Sky at just Alina Pete at Blue Sky Social, I think. But just search for my full name on there. That's where I'm posting all my thoughts.
Cool. And I'll throw the links in the notes and the description, so it'll be there. All right, well, that's it. I'm going to push you back out into the cold, but I'd love to give you the parting word. Do you have any words of wisdom as you cross the threshold?
Hug your friends tight and read lots of stories.
Apparently, there's a problem with shifting ley lines beneath the tavern, so I'm going to have to close up shop early and go check that out. But before I push you out the door, once again, thank you to Alina for stopping by and sharing their interesting stories, wisdom, and insights. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, sharing, and exploring those worlds and stories. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.